The private jet lounge was a haven of exclusivity. The hum of soft jazz floated through the air, mingling with the faint clinking of glasses. Polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of carefully placed lighting, and the muted tones of expensive furniture exuded sophistication. The clientele matched the setting, affluent, composed, and predominantly white. Seated in the corner, Elijah Carter appeared unbothered by the air of quiet wealth around him. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and polished Oxford shoes, his understated accessories, a sleek watch and simple cufflinks, spoke volumes about his success. His calm focus was directed toward a stack of neatly arranged notes, which he flipped through as he sipped his coffee. The hum of conversation ebbed and flowed around him, but Elijah was in his element. This was his sanctuary, a brief moment of peace before an important meeting about a new project that could revolutionize the tech industry. A movement from across the room caught his attention. A lounge attendant, a young woman named Grace, approached him with measured steps. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Elijah noticed the hesitation in her demeanor immediately. "Excuse me, sir," Grace began, her voice polite but tinged with discomfort. "May I have a word with you?" Elijah looked up, his calm brown eyes meeting hers. "Of course. Is there an issue?" Grace hesitated, glancing behind her. Elijah followed her gaze and spotted the lounge manager, Mr. Pierce, standing nearby. His suit was sharp, his hair immaculately styled, but his posture and expression were far less welcoming. He strode over, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Good afternoon," Pierce began, his tone smooth but laced with condescension. "I'm afraid this lounge is reserved for certain clientele. It's possible there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining calm. "I don't believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm a member." Pierce's smile tightened. "I see. May I ask for your membership card?" Without a word, Elijah reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and retrieved the card, handing it over with a steady hand. Pierce took it, inspecting it as though searching for something to discredit. A brief silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Several patrons had taken notice of the interaction. Some glanced over briefly before returning to their conversations, while others exchanged knowing looks or smirked, as though validating assumptions they hadn't dared voice aloud. Pierce handed the card back, his expression unreadable. "Well, Mr. Carter, it seems your card is valid. However, I'd like to confirm this with management to ensure everything is in order. These lounges can be exclusive and we take our policies seriously." Elijah's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it. He met Pierce's gaze evenly, his voice steady. "By all means, take your time." As Pierce turned to speak with another staff member, Grace lingered awkwardly. I'm sorry, sir," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's just protocol." Elijah's lips curved into a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Protocol can often be revealing. Pierce returned moments later, his tone slightly sharper. "I've spoken to management, and while your card checks out, I'd like to ask you to step aside. There may still be a mistake with the system. We've had issues with unauthorized access before." The sting of his words hung in the air, but Elijah remained composed. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket as he did. Of course. If there's an issue, I trust it will be resolved soon." As Elijah gathered his belongings, he felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him. He was no stranger to this. The thinly veiled suspicion, the subtle glances, the unspoken question of whether he belonged. He had seen it too many times before, and though it no longer surprised him, the sting was no less sharp. One patron, an older man seated nearby, leaned toward his companion and whispered, loud enough for Elijah to hear, "You'd think they'd screen people better for these lounges." Another patron smirked. "Must have gotten lucky with that membership." Elijah straightened, his calm demeanor intact despite the turmoil within. He glanced at the lounge manager who was waiting with an air of expectation, and then at the patrons whose stares lingered on him. His silence spoke louder than any retort could. Pierce stepped forward, his voice firm. "If you'd follow me, Mr. Carter, we can resolve this matter quickly." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "I trust you'll handle it professionally. I'll wait outside for an update." He turned and walked toward the exit, the murmurs of the lounge patrons fading behind him. He didn't look back, but every step felt heavy, laden with the unspoken accusations he had faced. As he reached the door, he paused for a brief moment, his hand resting on the handle. He straightened his shoulders, drawing strength from the quiet resolve that had carried him through countless moments like this. This wasn't over. It never was. But Elijah knew one thing for certain: this challenge, like all the others, wouldn't break him. Elijah's hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he gathered his belongings. His face betrayed no emotion, but his chest felt heavy, the weight of humiliation pressing down. He'd been here before. Not in this lounge, not with these people, but in this same moment. A moment when judgment was passed without a word of truth spoken. A voice from his past surfaced in his mind, a memory as vivid as the sting of the present. "You don't belong here, Elijah. People like you never do." It had been his fifth-grade teacher, a man who rarely looked him in the eye, who dismissed his questions with a sigh of annoyance. Elijah remembered sitting at his desk that day, clutching his notebook, and wondering what made him different. Years later, he knew. It wasn't his abilities, it was the color of his skin. He shook the thought away, his fingers tightening around his briefcase handle. As the whispers grew louder behind him, he adjusted his tie. A snippet of conversation reached him, sharp as a needle. "Must have slipped through the cracks," one patron muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. Another chuckled softly. "Doesn't exactly scream jet owner, does he?" Elijah straightened, his calm exterior shielding the storm inside. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. Outside the lounge, the hum of airport activity buzzed around him. Elijah pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant, Natalie. Her voice, warm and confident, answered almost immediately. "Hey, Elijah, what's going on?" "There's an issue with the lounge access," he said evenly. "Apparently, my membership isn't enough to convince them I belong." Natalie exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable. Everything's in place. You're supposed to be there, Elijah. Let me call the jet company and make sure they know this is unacceptable." "I'll handle it," Elijah replied, his tone steady but tired. "Just make sure they're ready for the flight. And one more thing, make sure my name is on the plane, clearly visible." Natalie paused, sensing the frustration beneath his calm words. "They'll see exactly who you are soon enough," she said firmly. "Let me know if you need anything else." Elijah hung up and leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. Moments like these always left a mark, no matter how many times he faced them. He glanced back toward the lounge, where the glass windows revealed a world still buzzing with quiet judgment. Inside, Mr. Pierce stood near the counter, speaking in hushed tones with another staff member, Claire. "I just don't buy it," Pierce muttered, shaking his head. "Better safe than sorry. He doesn't look like the kind of person we usually have in here." Claire hesitated, her brow furrowing. "But his card checked out and he didn't do anything wrong. Are you sure? Pierce cut her off with a wave of his hand. We've got a reputation to maintain. I'm not taking any chances. Just keep an eye on things. Claire nodded reluctantly, but doubt lingered in her eyes. She glanced toward the lounge entrance where Elijah had left moments before. Something about the entire interaction didn't sit right with her. Elijah's experience wasn't unique, not to him, and not to others who had been excluded from spaces like this. The lounge was a symbol of something far larger, a system that operated on subtle biases and quiet exclusions, ensuring that some people were always outsiders, no matter their accomplishments. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Natalie popped up. "Everything's set. Let me know if they still give you trouble." He smiled faintly and typed back, "Thank you. I'll handle it." He didn't need to fight this battle in their arena. He'd wait calmly and confidently by the gate, let them see the truth on his terms. Standing near the gate, Elijah glanced at the time. The sting of prejudice still lingered, but his resolve was stronger. He wouldn't let this moment define him. Moments later, he sent Natalie another message. "Let's make sure they never question who I am again." The steady hum of the PA system cut through the lounge, a voice announcing the imminent departure of a private jet. The lounge's casual murmurs stilled as heads turned toward the gate. Moments later, a sleek aircraft rolled into view. The metallic sheen of the jet reflected the afternoon sunlight, and bold lettering on its side caught everyone's attention. Carter Industries. The name stood proud, undeniable, and unshakable. It demanded attention. The whispers started immediately. "That can't be his," someone murmured, their tone equal parts disbelief and discomfort. "Carter Industries? Wait, you don't think—" Another voice trailed off, uncertain. Behind the counter, Claire's fingers froze on her keyboard. She turned to Mr. Pierce, who had been watching the scene with growing unease. His jaw tightened as realization dawned. "Claire," he started, his voice strained. "Are you telling me—" Claire nodded slowly, the faintest hint of reproach in her eyes. "Yes, the jet belongs to Elijah Carter. He's the Carter." The color drained from Pierce's face. His hands, which had been neatly folded, now clenched at his sides. He looked toward the gate where the jet waited, its name a glaring reminder of his mistake. Elijah, standing calmly near the entrance, noticed the shift in energy within the lounge. The same patrons who had smirked earlier now avoided his gaze. Conversations quieted, their judgment replaced by awkward silence. Pierce cleared his throat, his usual confidence faltering. Claire, handle this," he muttered, taking a step back. But Claire didn't move. Instead, she glanced toward Elijah, then back at Pierce. "You should be the one to talk to him," she said softly, her tone firm. Pierce hesitated, but before he could act, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the tension. Grace rushed toward Elijah, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice shaky. Elijah turned to face her, his expression calm but unreadable. I just wanted to apologize," Grace stammered. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." She trailed off, fumbling for the right words. "I'm so sorry for how you were treated. Please, if there's anything I can do—" Elijah held up a hand, silencing her gently. His gaze shifted past Grace, landing on the lounge's large windows. Inside, the patrons and staff watched him, their faces a mix of guilt and curiosity. With measured steps, Elijah walked toward the glass, his back straight and his presence commanding. Grace followed a step behind, her head bowed. He stopped in full view of the lounge. For a moment he said nothing, letting the weight of the silence settle. Then, his voice, calm but firm, filled the space. "I've worked my entire life to build what you see," Elijah began, his eyes sweeping over the room. "Carter Industries didn't come from privilege or shortcuts. It came from determination, resilience, and more long nights than I can count." The room remained silent, every pair of eyes locked on him. "But no matter what I achieve," he continued, his voice steady, "there are always those who believe I don't belong, that I don't deserve to be here, that someone like me couldn't possibly own something like this." He gestured toward the jet. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes dropping to their laps. "This plane, it's mine," Elijah said, his tone sharp. "But respect? That's something I have to fight for over and over again, and not because of what I've done, but because of what I look like." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Think about that," he said quietly, before turning and walking toward the jet. Grace stayed rooted in place, her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. Inside the lounge, Pierce stood frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. The other patrons avoided each other's eyes, their unease palpable. The murmurs began again, but this time they carried a different tone, guilt, perhaps even shame. As Elijah reached the jet, the door opened, and the pilot greeted him warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. Everything's ready for takeoff." "Thank you," Elijah replied, stepping inside without looking back. The door closed with a faint hiss, sealing the world outside. Moments later, the engines roared to life, their sound cutting through the lingering silence of the lounge. Inside, Pierce's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his confidence replaced by a sinking realization. Claire glanced at him, her expression unreadable, before turning back to her computer. The jet began to taxi, its engines echoing through the terminal. The patrons, staff, and Pierce all watched as it disappeared into the sky, leaving behind a heavy, unspoken truth. Pierce sat stiffly in the manager's office, his hands clasped tightly on the desk in front of him. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers as Claire reviewed the written complaint she'd filed against him. She looked up, her expression firm but professional. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Pierce," Claire began. "It's about what this lounge represents. The way you treated Mr. Carter wasn't just wrong. It's part of a pattern that needs to change." Pierce opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable realization of the damage his actions had caused. He finally nodded, though his jaw remained tight. Claire handed the report to the airport management representative who stood nearby. "This is a formal complaint," she said firmly, "and I'll make sure it doesn't get buried." The representative nodded solemnly. "We've already launched a full review of our policies. Implicit bias training will be mandatory for all staff moving forward. This won't happen again." Pierce looked down, his shoulders slumping slightly. The weight of accountability had finally caught up with him. In another corner of the airport, Grace sat alone during her break, scrolling through her phone. She paused at an article about diversity and inclusion training programs, her mind replaying her interactions with Elijah earlier that day. "He didn't deserve that," she whispered to herself, guilt washing over her. With a deep breath, she clicked on the link and began reading. As she bookmarked the page, her resolve hardened. She would educate herself, take the training, and ensure she never repeated the same mistakes. On board the private jet, Elijah leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the city below disappeared beneath the clouds. His mind wandered back to the day's events, the sting of Pierce's words, and the judgmental stares of the lounge patrons still fresh in his memory. But he also thought of the moments of progress. the quiet determination of Claire, the growing accountability from the airport management, and Natalie's unwavering support. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Picking it up, he read the text from Natalie. "Just landed back here. How are you holding up?" Elijah smiled faintly and typed back, "I'm fine, thanks to you. Couldn't have handled it without your quick thinking." The response was immediate. "You didn't need me. They'll never forget who you are now." Elijah set the phone down and let his head rest against the seat. Progress was slow, but it was happening. The fight for equality wasn't over, but every moment like this brought them one step closer. When the jet landed, Elijah stepped off to a vibrant welcome. A group of young entrepreneurs, diverse in every sense of the word, stood waiting for him, their excitement evident in their eager smiles and applause. "Mr. Carter," one of them called out, stepping forward to shake his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you. We've all been inspired by your story." Elijah shook hands with each of them, his own smile widening. "Thank you," he said. "It's an honor to be here. Let's get started." The conference room buzzed with energy as Elijah took the stage, the room packed with aspiring entrepreneurs from different walks of life. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the faces before him. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I want to start by saying this. Success isn't about where you come from, it's about where you're going. But let's be honest, it's a lot harder to get there when the world keeps telling you that you don't belong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "I've faced prejudice and doubt at every step of my journey," Elijah continued. "But I refused to let that stop me. Instead, I used it as fuel to build something they couldn't ignore. And that's what I want for each of you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Don't let others define where you belong," he said, his voice growing firmer. "Build your own spaces, and when they ask how you got there, show them who you are. Show them what you've built. That's how we change the game." The room erupted into applause, the sound swelling with admiration and hope. Elijah stepped back, letting the energy wash over him, his heart full. As the applause faded, Elijah stepped down from the stage, pausing to speak with some of the attendees. Their words of gratitude and encouragement reminded him why he kept fighting, why every moment of prejudice and struggle was worth enduring. One young man, barely in his 20s, shook Elijah's hand with a firm grip. "I never thought I'd see someone like me stand where you are," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing us what's possible." Elijah smiled, his voice quiet but resolute. "You'll be standing here soon enough. Just keep going." As the day came to a close, Elijah stepped outside, the evening air cool against his skin. He paused for a moment, looking out at the city skyline. The battle wasn't over. It never would be. But progress was being made, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. With quiet determination, he straightened his jacket and walked toward his next challenge, his steps steady, his purpose clear.